At a certain point in life, you've noticed this pattern. As evening deepens and the world settles into sleep, something inside you refuses to follow. 10 o'clock passes, then 11. The house grows quiet. Other people's bedroom lights go dark one by one. And there you are, wide awake, not with restless anxiety but with a painful clarity. Your body might be tired, your eyes might burn, but some faculty of consciousness will not dim. And naturally, when this happens night after night, you begin to worry. You think there's something wrong with you. You research sleep hygiene, buy blackout curtains, download meditation apps, try melatonin and chamomile tea, and all the remedies promising to deliver you to sleep at a normal hour. You feel increasingly isolated, increasingly broken, as if you're the only person who can't perform this basic human function. You watch the clock approach midnight with familiar dread, knowing tomorrow you'll wake exhausted, out of sync with the world's rhythms, fundamentally misaligned with how life is supposed to work. But what if I told you that Kierkegaard saw this midnight wakefulness not as insomnia at all, but as a particular form of consciousness that some souls simply cannot escape? You see, most of what we call sleep problems rests on a hidden assumption that there is one correct relationship to darkness and rest, that all human beings are meant to surrender to sleep at the same hour, in the same way. The medical establishment will tell you about circadian rhythms and cortisol levels and the importance of consistency. The self-help industry will promise better sleep through the right routine, the right supplements, the right evening ritual. And underneath all of this lies the unquestioned belief that if you cannot sleep before midnight, something in you has failed. But Kierkegaard, who himself wandered Copenhagen streets late into the night, who wrote his most piercing insights in hours when others slept, understood something different. He understood that certain souls are constituted in such a way that they cannot accept the consolations that allow other people to rest. They cannot perform what he called the leap of faith into the innocence of sleep. They remain, despite exhaustion, despite desire, irrevocably awake to something the daylight world carefully obscures. Think of it this way. There are animals that are naturally diurnal and animals that are naturally nocturnal. We don't say an owl has insomnia because it cannot sleep at night. We don't try to cure a wolf of its tendency to hunt under the moon. We understand these creatures have a different relationship to darkness, that their eyes adjust to see what day-dwelling animals cannot perceive. Human beings are not divided so cleanly into day and night species. But there are souls, particular configurations of consciousness, that simply cannot rest while certain questions remain unresolved, while certain truths remain unacknowledged, while the machinery of daily distraction still hums in the background. These are not people with a sleep disorder. These are people with a temperament that refuses to let them escape into unconsciousness until something has been witnessed, something has been confronted, something has been allowed to surface that busy daylight hours keep carefully suppressed. Kierkegaard called this state despair, but he didn't mean the word the way we usually understand it. He meant a fundamental restlessness of the soul, a condition of being unable to rest in any fixed identity or comfortable illusion. He wrote that most people live in a kind of sleep even when they're awake, moving through their days in fog of distraction and habit and unexamined assumptions. But some people cannot sustain this sleepwalk. They wake up in the middle of their lives to a terrible clarity. And then they cannot go back to sleep, not in the old way, not at the old hour, because something in them has seen through the collective dream that makes ordinary rest possible. Let me give you an analogy. Imagine you've spent your entire life in a city, surrounded by streetlights and neon signs and the ambient glow of human activity. The darkness in such places is never total. There's always light pollution, always this diffuse brightness that lets you see shapes and move around without truly confronting darkness. Now imagine being taken suddenly to the middle of the wilderness, far from any city on a moonless night. At first, the darkness is overwhelming. Your eyes, accustomed to artificial light, cannot adjust. You feel blind, disoriented, almost frightened by the totality of it. You want desperately to get back to that comfortable urban twilight, where you could see enough to function without facing the full depth of night. But if you stay there, if you don't flee back to the city, something remarkable happens. Slowly, over minutes and then hours, your eyes begin to adapt. The darkness that seemed absolute begins to differentiate. You start to perceive gradations of shadow, textures in the blackness, the faint light of distant stars becoming visible. And eventually you can see in this darkness, in a way impossible in the light-polluted city. You can see the Milky Way stretching across the sky. You can watch meteors streak through the atmosphere. You can perceive beauty and truth that exists only when artificial light is removed. This is what's happening when you cannot sleep before midnight. The daylight hours, with all their activity and noise and stimulation, are like that city with its streetlights. They provide just enough illumination to function, to move through required tasks, to maintain social performance. But they also obscure something deeper, something that requires a different kind of vision to perceive. When midnight approaches and you're still awake, your consciousness is adjusting to a different register. You're seeing through the artificial light of daytime assumptions. And in that seeing, in that terrible clarity, sleep becomes impossible. Not because you're anxious or because your sleep hygiene is poor, but because some part of you refuses to look away from what the darkness is revealing. Kierkegaard would say you're experiencing what he called the sickness unto death, not a literal death wish, but a condition of being unable to rest in any stable identity, unable to escape into the comfortable fictions that allow most people to move through their days without existential vertigo. And this period can last quite a while. It can last months or years, because what's happening is not something that can be fixed with better sleep hygiene, or a new mattress, or the right supplement. What's happening is a fundamental reorganization of how you relate to consciousness itself. The usual response is to try desperately to force yourself back into the old pattern. You set strict bedtimes, you avoid screens after 8 p.m., you exercise earlier in the day. You create elaborate evening rituals designed to trick your body into sleepiness at 10 o'clock. But this doesn't work, because you're treating a spiritual condition as if it were a mechanical problem. You're trying to turn the lights back on in a consciousness that has already seen what exists in the darkness. I must warn you about something. When people first encounter this idea that their insomnia might be something other than dysfunction, might be a form of heightened consciousness, they often make the mistake of romanticizing it. They think they're special souls who see what others cannot, more awake, more aware, more authentically alive than those poor sleepers who can rest at normal hours. This is a trap. Kierkegaard understood that this midnight consciousness is not a mark of superiority or advancement. Gad's simply a different form of suffering, a different configuration of human limitation. The person who sleeps easily at 9 p.m. and the person who cannot sleep before midnight are both struggling with the basic condition of being human, the condition of being conscious beings who must somehow find a way to rest despite consciousness, who must find a way to surrender despite awareness. Let me tell you about someone I knew years ago. He was a mathematician, brilliant in his field, but for most of his adult life he'd struggled with what he called chronic insomnia. Every night he would lie in bed at 10 p.m. trying to will himself to sleep, failing, and then spending hours in miserable frustration. He tried every remedy. He saw sleep specialists. He took medications that left him groggy but never truly rested. For years he thought of this as his primary problem. Then something shifted. He started noticing that his most profound mathematical insights came to him between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., not when he was trying to solve problems, but when he was simply sitting in the darkness, his mind moving through abstractions without the pressure of daytime productivity. One night he was sitting in his study around midnight, not fighting the wakefulness anymore, just allowing it, and he suddenly understood a problem he'd been working on for months. The solution appeared not through effort, but through a kind of relaxed attention that was only possible in those late hours. And he realized that he'd been trying to cure the very condition that made his best work possible. He wasn't suffering from insomnia. He was suffering from the belief that he should be someone who could sleep at 10 p.m., someone whose consciousness dimmed on schedule. After that recognition, he stopped fighting it. He rearranged his life around his natural rhythm. He worked late, slept late, and stopped judging himself by the standard of people whose souls could rest earlier. What emerges in those midnight hours, when you stop fighting them, is not excitement or drama or anything that looks impressive from the outside. It's something quieter and stranger. It's a particular quality of presence, a way of being with yourself without the armor of daytime identity, without the roles and performances and carefully maintained stories you tell about who you are. During the day, we're always someone, a professional, a parent, a friend, a productive member of society. We're playing our parts, fulfilling our functions, maintaining our reputations. But late at night, when the world is asleep and there's no one to perform for, those identities become transparent. You're just there, just conscious, without any particular claim to be anything special. It's not nothing, this midnight consciousness. It's brutally specific. It's the moment when you realize you've been living according to scripts written by others, when you see how much of your daily life is performance and reaction rather than authentic response. It's the recognition that most of your anxiety during the day comes from trying to be someone you're not, trying to fit into rhythms and patterns that were never yours to begin with. And it's painful, this recognition. It's why so many people fight their midnight wakefulness with such desperation. Because if you allow it, if you stop treating it as a problem to be solved, you have to face these truths. You have to see yourself without the flattering light of daytime illusions. But there's also something else that emerges. Once your eyes adjust to this darkness, once you stop fighting the wakefulness and simply inhabit it, there's a quality of rest that has nothing to do with sleep. It's not the rest of unconsciousness. It's the rest of no longer pretending, no longer performing, no longer maintaining the exhausting fiction that you're supposed to be someone other than who you are. So what do you actually do during these midnight hours? You do very simple things. You sit in the darkness without immediately reaching for a book or a screen. You let your thoughts move without trying to direct them. You observe what surfaces when there's no agenda, no productivity requirement, no one watching. You might write, but not with the goal of producing something impressive. You might walk, but not as exercise. You might simply sit and watch the shadows in your room change as the night deepens. The key is doing these things without expectation, without trying to force insight or resolution or anything that looks like progress. And you watch, you observe how your mind works when it's not being pressed into the service of daytime goals. You notice the thoughts that come up, the memories, the questions, the unnamed feelings that have been waiting all day for this kind of attention. You don't try to analyze them, or fix them, or turn them into content for some self-improvement project. You just let them be there, moving through your consciousness like clouds moving through a dark sky. And most importantly, you stop comparing yourself to people who can sleep at normal hours. You stop thinking of your midnight wakefulness as a deviation from some standard of health or normality. You stop trying to become someone whose soul can rest at 10 p.m. This doesn't mean you indulge in unhealthy behaviors or deliberately sabotage your rest. It means you stop waging war against your own nature. You arrange your life as much as possible around the rhythm that's actually yours rather than the rhythm you think you should have. Maybe this means finding work that allows flexible hours. Maybe it means protecting your late nights and late mornings as sacred time. Maybe it means explaining to people that you're not available at 9 a.m., not because you're lazy, but because your consciousness operates on a different schedule. Paradoxically, it's only when you stop trying to sleep at the right hour that you begin to find actual rest. Not the rest of unconsciousness, but the deeper rest of no longer fighting yourself, no longer treating your natural rhythm as a disorder to be cured. The soul that cannot sleep before midnight is not a broken soul. It's a soul that requires certain conditions, darkness, solitude, the absence of daytime performance, in order to maintain its particular kind of truthfulness. Perhaps the reason you cannot sleep before midnight is that you've outgrown the version of yourself that could rest in easy answers, that could accept surface explanations, that could ignore the questions that emerge only in darkness. Not because you're better than others, but because your particular soul is constituted in such a way that it cannot perform the daily forgetting that others achieve so naturally. And when you accept this, when you stop treating it as pathology, you discover you're not alone. Throughout history, the poets and philosophers and mystics who saw most clearly were often the ones who could not sleep at normal hours. So when you lie awake at 11:30, watching the clock approach midnight, don't despair. You haven't lost the ability to sleep. You've lost the ability to pretend that sleep is simply unconsciousness, simply an escape from the day. You've discovered that rest, real rest, requires first a kind of wakefulness so complete that it strips away every comfortable illusion. And then, only then, when you've seen what needs to be seen, when you've stopped fighting your own nature, sleep might come. Not at 10 p.m., not when it's supposed to, but at its own hour, in its own time. Walk into that darkness. Not by trying to sleep through it, but by being so completely awake to it that the distinction between waking and sleeping begins to dissolve. You just forgot for a while that some souls are made for midnight,